Have you ever wondered how a city with 1 million people simply vanished into thin air? Deep in the jungles of Cambodia, giant stone faces stare out from the trees. These ruins are all that remain of the Khmer Empire. This was once the most powerful kingdom on earth. It was bigger than any city in Europe at the time. It was a golden world of massive temples and endless wealth. But there is a huge mystery here. How did they build such a giant city in the middle of a swamp? For years, historians were baffled. They saw the beautiful temples, but they couldn't see the truth. Now, thanks to new laser technology, we have finally found the answer. It wasn't just about magic or gods. It was about a hidden machine made of water. Before we dive into this ancient smart city, I have a special reward for you. If you stay until the very end of this video, I am going to reveal a shocking discovery found at the bottom of a dry canal. This one object proves exactly why the city died. It is a warning for our own modern world that you cannot afford to miss. To understand the Khmer, we have to look at the land they lived on. Cambodia is a place of extremes. For half the year, the sky opens up. Massive rainstorms called monsoons flood everything. The rivers actually flow backward. But then, the rain stops for 6 months. The ground turns to dust. The crops die. Most people would just give up and move away. But the Khmer did something different. They decided to fight the weather. They didn't just survive the water, they mastered it. They built a water kingdom that changed the world forever. This is how they turned a nightmare landscape into a paradise, and how that same paradise eventually became their grave. To understand how the Khmer Empire became a superpower, you first have to understand the land they lived on. Cambodia is a place of extreme drama. It is not like most countries where the weather is predictable. Here, nature has 2 moods, drowning or starving. For 6 months of the year, the sky opens up. These are the monsoon rains. They are not just light showers. They are massive walls of water that fall for days at a time. The ground becomes a giant sponge. Small streams turn into raging rivers. The Great Mekong River swells up with so much water that it actually forces another river, the Tonle Sap, to flow backward. Imagine a river so powerful it changes direction. This creates a massive inland lake that grows to 5 times its normal size. It swallows the forests. It floods the fields. It turns the entire landscape into a world of mud and water. But then the rain stops. For the next 6 months, the sun beats down. The heat is intense. The water evaporates. The lush green jungle turns brown and brittle. The giant lake shrinks away. The mud turns into hard, cracked earth. If you were a farmer living 1,000 years ago, this was a nightmare. You had too much water when you didn't need it, and no water when your crops were dying. Most civilizations in history grew up near steady rivers, like the Nile or the Indus. But the Khmer were different. They chose to build their heartland in a place that tried to kill them every year. Why did they do it? The answer lies in the mud. When the floods receded, they left behind incredibly rich soil. This soil was like gold for growing rice. If you could control the water, you could grow enough food to feed an army. If you could tame the monsoon, you could rule the world. This challenge created a new kind of leader. In the year 802, a man named Jayavarman II declared himself a god king. He didn't just claim to lead the people, he claimed to own the rain. He stood on a mountain and told his followers that he was the link between heaven and earth. To prove it, he promised to do the impossible. He promised to trap the monsoon. This was the birth of the Water Kingdom. The Khmer didn't just build huts and farms. They began to reshape the very crust of the earth. They used thousands of elephants and millions of workers to dig. They weren't digging graves or basement foundations. They were digging the largest plumbing system in human history. The Khmer engineers realized that they needed a way to save the flood for the drought. They began to build something called Barays. A baray is a giant reservoir, but it is not like a modern dam. They didn't build walls across rivers. Instead, they built massive dirt embankments to hold water above the ground. Think of it like a giant bathtub sitting on top of a flat plain. The scale was mind-blowing. The first big reservoirs were miles long. They could hold millions of gallons of water. By doing this, the god kings created a buffer against nature. When the rains came, they captured the excess. When the dry season arrived, they opened the gates. This changed everything for the average person. Suddenly, farmers didn't have to wait for the rain. They had a steady supply of water all year round. This allowed them to grow 2 or even 3 crops of rice every year. In the ancient world, food was the ultimate currency. If you have more rice than your neighbors, you have more power. You can pay for more soldiers. You can feed more stonecutters. You can build bigger temples. The Khmer population exploded. Small villages merged into towns. Towns merged into cities. Because they had conquered the water, they could now build a city that the world had never seen before. But as the city grew, the water system had to grow too. It became a giant machine that never stopped moving. Every house, every street, and every temple was part of the grid. The engineers built thousands of miles of canals. Some were wide enough for large boats, others were small channels that ran into private gardens. They built stone bridges with faces of giants. They built hidden valves and overflow drains. It was the world's first smart city, designed hundreds of years before the steam engine was even a dream. The city of Angkor became a sprawling landscape of water and stone. From the air, it would have looked like a giant circuit board made of blue lines. However, there was a hidden danger in this success. To keep the water flowing, they had to keep building. Every new king wanted a bigger reservoir than the last one. They were fighting a war against time and gravity. The water brought life, but it also brought silt. Silt is fine sand and mud that travels in river water. As the water slowed down in the canals, the mud settled at the bottom. Slowly, the canals began to fill up. If a canal gets blocked, the water has nowhere to go. It backs up, it breaks the walls, it floods the homes. The Khmer were now stuck in a cycle. They had to spend more and more time cleaning the canals and fixing the banks. They had built a system so large and so complex that it required constant care. They were also changing the environment around them. To build these massive earthworks, they had to cut down the forests. The trees were the only things holding the soil in place. Without the trees, the heavy monsoon rains washed the dirt straight into the water system. This made the silt problem even worse. They were accidentally choking their own city. At the time, they didn't realize it. They saw the golden temples rising. They saw the rice piles growing higher. They thought they had won. They thought they were masters of the earth. They didn't know that every bucket of dirt they moved was bringing them closer to a disaster. The god kings became obsessed with glory. They stopped focusing on the drains and started focusing on the gold. They built Angkor Wat, a temple so big it is still the largest religious monument on the planet. They surrounded it with a moat that is 600 feet wide. For a long time, people thought the moat was for protection against enemies. But scientists now know the truth. The moat was a giant weight. It held the groundwater at a perfect level so the massive stone temple wouldn't sink into the soft mud. The temple itself was a part of the water machine. Science and religion were the same thing to the Khmer. As we look at the peak of this empire, everything looks perfect. 1 million people are living in harmony with the water. The markets are full of fish and grain. The king sits on a throne of gold. But under the surface, the machine is starting to rattle. The climate is shifting. The canals are filling with mud. The forests are gone. The Khmer have built a paradise, but they have also built a very fragile web. They have no plan B. They have spent 500 years perfecting one single way of life. If anything changes, if the rain stops for too long or comes too hard, the entire machine will break. And as we are about to see, the sky was preparing a trap that would wipe them off the map. If you stood in the center of Angkor 1,000 years ago, you wouldn't just see buildings, you would see water everywhere. To build the world's largest city, the Khmer had to become the world's greatest earth movers. They didn't have steel, steam engines, or computers. They had muscles, elephants, and a perfect understanding of math. Their greatest achievement wasn't actually the famous temples. It was the Barays. These were giant, man-made lakes that defied the laws of nature. Take a look at the West Baray. It is a massive rectangle of water. It is 5 miles long and over 1 mile wide. It is so large that you can see it from space. In fact, for a long time, pilots flying over the jungle thought it was a natural lake. But it isn't. Every single inch of it was planned. Every bucket of dirt was moved by hand. Imagine millions of people lining up for decades. They dug into the tropical soil with wooden shovels. They carried heavy baskets of earth on their backs. They piled this dirt up to create massive walls or dikes that were 3 stories high. Why did they go to all this trouble? Because the Khmer knew something that we are only rediscovering today. To survive a changing climate, you must be able to store your resources. The West Baray could hold over 12 billion gallons of water. That is enough to fill 20,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. By building these reservoirs, the Khmer created an artificial wet season that lasted all year. Even when the sun was scorching the earth and the nearby rivers were drying up, the Barays stayed full. But holding the water was only half the battle. You also had to move it. This is where the Khmer showed their true genius. They understood gravity. They built their city on a very slight slope. The northern part of the city was just a few feet higher than the southern part. This tiny difference was enough. They built a network of thousands of small gates and stone valves. When a farmer miles away needed water for his rice, an official would open a wooden gate at the reservoir. The water would spill out, rushing down a perfectly straight canal. It would turn corners, split into smaller streams, and eventually flow directly into the farmer's field. It was a masterclass in civil engineering. They even figured out how to keep the water from moving too fast. If water moves too quickly, it destroys the dirt walls of the canals, so they built staircases made of stone. The water would flow down one level, slow down, and then drop to the next. This kept the system stable for centuries. This wasn't just a project for one king, it was a multi-generational mission. Each king added a new baray, a new canal, or a new temple. They were building a giant, living machine that covered hundreds of square miles. It was the most complex piece of technology on the planet. Because they mastered the water, the Khmer were able to create a lifestyle that was unheard of in the ancient world. While people in London or Paris were living in cramped, dirty wooden houses, the people of Angkor were living in a tropical paradise. Because they had so much rice, they didn't have to spend all their time farming. This led to an explosion of art, music, and trade. Angkor was a low-density megacity. This means it wasn't crowded with tall buildings. Instead, it was a forest city. Every house had its own garden and its own small pond. The city was a giant grid of green and blue. There were fruit trees everywhere, mangoes, coconuts, and bananas. The canals weren't just for irrigation, they were the highways of the city. Thousands of wooden boats zipped back and forth. They carried spices from China, gold from the mountains, and silk from distant lands. The center of this world was the market. Imagine a place louder and more colorful than anything you've ever seen. Merchants from all over Asia traveled here because Angkor was the richest city in the East. You could hear dozens of languages being spoken. You could smell exotic incense and roasting fish. The Khmer people were famous for their love of festivals. They had boat races on the Great Lake. They had massive parades where elephants were dressed in silk and gold. But life wasn't just about fun. It was a highly organized society. Everyone had a job to do in the water machine. There were water officers whose only job was to check the levels of the canals. There were teams of laborers who spent their whole lives clearing mud out of the channels. There were stonemasons who worked day and night to carve the faces of gods into the temple walls. At the top of this pyramid was the king. He lived in a palace made of fine wood and gold. When he traveled through the city, he sat on a golden litter carried by dozens of men. He was surrounded by soldiers holding umbrellas, decorated with jewels. To the people, he wasn't just a man. He was the reason the water flowed. He was the reason the rice grew. As long as the king was happy, the gods were happy, and the machine kept turning. However, this lifestyle had a massive cost. To keep 1 million people fed, the Khmer had to clear more and more land. They pushed further into the jungle. They cut down the ancient trees to make room for more rice paddies. They didn't realize that the trees were the skin of the earth. When the trees were gone, the soil became loose. Every time it rained, the red Cambodian dirt washed into the beautiful clean canals. The city was getting bigger, but it was also getting clogged. The arteries of the city, the canals, were starting to fill with silt. The water was moving slower. The reservoirs were becoming shallower. For a long time, the Khmer were so rich and powerful that they could just throw more laborers at the problem. If a canal filled up, they dug a new one. If a reservoir got shallow, they built a bigger one. They thought their growth could last forever. They were so confident that they built the most famous monument in history, Angkor Wat. This temple was the ultimate symbol of their success. It was a stone map of the universe. It took 30 years and millions of tons of sandstone to build. The stones were cut so perfectly that you couldn't even fit a human hair between them. They floated these stones down the canals on rafts from mountains 30 miles away. But while the priests were chanting in the golden temples, the engineers were starting to worry. The system was becoming too complex. It was like a giant clock with too many gears. If one gear broke, the whole clock stopped. They had reached the limit of what their technology could handle. They were now totally dependent on a climate that was about to change. The hydraulic Megacity was at its absolute peak, but it was standing on a foundation of shifting sand. The Golden Age was about to meet the ultimate test, a change in the Earth's temperature that would turn their water kingdom into a watery grave. To understand the absolute height of the Khmer Empire, you have to look at one single building, Angkor Wat. This isn't just a temple, it is the largest religious monument ever built in human history. It is so massive that it contains more stone than the Great Pyramid of Giza. But while the pyramids are solid blocks, Angkor Wat is a masterpiece of delicate art. Every wall is covered in carvings. There are thousands of apsaras, or heavenly dancers, carved into the stone. There are miles of bas-reliefs that tell the story of great battles, hopping monkeys, and ancient gods. When travelers from China first saw it, they couldn't believe their eyes. They thought it was built by giants or by the gods themselves. But the real magic of Angkor Wat isn't just the art, it is the engineering hidden beneath the surface. Remember, this giant stone mountain was built on top of a swamp. Normally, a building this heavy would sink into the mud and collapse within a few years. So how did the Khmer keep it standing for nearly 1,000 years? The answer is water. The temple is surrounded by a giant moat that is 600 feet wide and nearly 4 miles long. For a long time, people thought the moat was for defense, like a castle. But it had a much more important job. The moat acted like a giant pressure regulator. It kept the ground underneath the temple perfectly soaked. If the ground dried out, the sand would shift and the temple would crack. If the ground got too wet, the temple would slide. By keeping the moat full of water at all times, the Khmer engineers created a steady water table. They used the weight of the water in the moat to push against the weight of the stone temple. It was a perfect balance of forces. This shows that at their peak, the Khmer didn't just use water for food, they used it as a structural tool. They were playing with physics on a scale that modern engineers still study today. The temple was also a giant clock. The Khmer were obsessed with the stars and the seasons. They aligned the central tower of Angkor Wat so perfectly that on the spring equinox, the sun rises exactly over the tip of the temple. This wasn't just for show. It was a signal to the farmers. It told the entire empire exactly when the rainy season was coming. It was the start button for the world's largest irrigation machine. When the sun hit that stone peak, millions of people knew it was time to prepare the canals. It was a union of heaven, earth and water. At this moment, around the year 1150, the Khmer Empire was the center of the universe. They were so rich that they plated their towers in real gold. The king Suryavarman II was treated like a living deity. He had thousands of servants who fanned him with peacock feathers. He had a navy of hundreds of warboats that controlled the Mekong River. The city around the temple was buzzing with life. There were hospitals, schools and libraries. There were paved roads that stretched for hundreds of miles into the jungle. It felt like the empire would last forever. But there was a dark side to this greatness. To build Angkor Wat, the empire had to use every single resource it had. They needed millions of tons of sandstone. This stone didn't exist at the site. It was in the Kulen Mountains, 30 miles away. To get the stone to the city, they had to dig a special canal just for transport. Thousands of men spent their entire lives cutting stone and floating it down the water on rafts. This took people away from the farms. It took money away from maintaining the older canals. The empire was becoming top-heavy. The kings were so focused on building bigger and better temples to show off their power that they started to ignore the boring parts of the city. They forgot about the drains. They forgot about the silt. They were building a massive stone crown, but the body of the city, the water system, was starting to get sick. As the city spread out to house 1 million people, the environment reached its breaking point. To feed everyone, the Khmer had to clear every single tree for miles around. This caused a massive problem called erosion. When the forest is gone, there are no roots to hold the dirt in place. When the heavy monsoon rains hit the bare ground, they wash tons of red mud into the canals. This mud is called silt. Silt is the silent killer of water systems. Slowly but surely, the deep canals became shallow. The water stopped flowing. Stagnant water became a breeding ground for mosquitoes and disease. The smart city was starting to clog up. The engineers tried to fix it by building bypass canals, but this just made the system more complicated. It was like trying to fix a leaky pipe by adding 10 more pipes. Eventually, the system became so complex that no one person truly understood how it all worked. It was a giant, fragile web of water. Then, the world changed. Far away from Cambodia, the Earth's climate began to shift. This was a period known as the Little Ice Age in Europe, but in Southeast Asia, it meant something different. It meant the monsoons became unpredictable. For decades, the rains would be weak, causing terrible droughts. Then, suddenly, the sky would release a mega-monsoon, a storm so powerful it could wash away entire villages. The Khmer were trapped. Their entire city was designed for a steady, predictable cycle of rain. Their canals were a specific size. Their reservoirs held a specific amount. They had no way to handle these new superstorms. The system they had spent 500 years building was about to be put to a test it couldn't pass. The very thing that made them a superpower, their total control over water, was about to become the weapon that destroyed them. Imagine a massive flood hitting a city where the canals are already full of mud. The water has nowhere to go. It backs up. It puts massive pressure on the dirt walls of the reservoirs. In the next chapter, we will see the moment the machine finally broke. We will see how a single summer of bad weather turned the world's greatest city into a muddy graveyard, and why the god kings were powerless to stop it. By the late 12th century, the Khmer Empire had reached a level of complexity that the world had never seen before. But there is a law in engineering The more complex a system becomes, the more ways it can fail. This is exactly what happened to Angkor. The city had grown into a giant, sprawling machine that covered nearly 400 square miles. To keep this machine running, every single part had to work perfectly. If one canal got blocked, 1,000 rice fields could dry up. If one dam burst, an entire neighborhood could be swept away. The city was now suffering from what scientists call the Red Queen effect. This is a situation where you have to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. The Khmer engineers were trapped in a cycle of constant repair. Because they had cleared so much forest to feed their million residents, the soil was no longer stable. Every time the monsoon rains hit the bare ground, they washed massive amounts of sediment into the water system. This sediment settled at the bottom of the canals, making them shallower every year. To fix this, the Khmer had to recruit more and more people just to shovel mud. Thousands of men who should have been farming or building were now stuck in the bottom of ditches, throwing mud over their shoulders. This was a massive drain on the empire's energy. But they couldn't stop. If they stopped cleaning the canals for even one season, the water would stop flowing and the city would starve. They were slaves to their own invention. They had built a city that was too big to fail, which is always a dangerous place to be. The design of the city also became its enemy. Earlier in their history, the Khmer built simple systems that followed the natural curves of the land. But as the god kings became more powerful, they wanted everything to be perfectly straight and symmetrical to show off their control over nature. They built massive rigid canals that cut straight across the landscape. These straight lines looked beautiful from the air, but they were a nightmare for water management. Natural rivers curve for a reason. It helps slow the water down and prevents erosion. The Khmer's straight canals forced the water to move too fast in some places and too slow in others. In the areas where the water moved too fast, it tore chunks out of the canal walls. In the areas where it moved too slow, it dropped all its mud and blocked the path. The engineers tried to fix this by building cross-channels to move water from one canal to another. This created a maze of thousands of intersections. Imagine a city with no traffic lights where every street is a one-way canal. If a blockage happened in the middle of this maze, the water would back up for miles, causing mini floods in parts of the city that weren't even near the main reservoirs. As the system became more tangled, the social structure of the empire began to crack as well. For centuries, the people believed the king was a god because he provided the water. But now the water was becoming unreliable. The miracle was starting to fail. When the water didn't arrive on time, the farmers didn't just lose their crops, they lost their faith. The god king started to look like just a man. This led to a lack of motivation. People were less willing to spend their lives cleaning canals for a leader who couldn't even control the rain. Then came the final engineering mistake. In a desperate attempt to get more water into the city, the engineers decided to tap into the Siem Reap River. They diverted the entire river into their man-made canal system. For a few years, this worked perfectly. It brought a fresh surge of water that filled the Barays and fed the crops. But the river brought something else, massive amounts of new sand and debris from the mountains. This was the last straw. The system was already struggling with silt, and now they had invited an entire river's worth of mud into their front door. The Khmer had created a technological trap. They couldn't go back to a simpler life because there were too many people to feed. But they couldn't move forward because the system was too heavy to maintain. They were sitting on a ticking time bomb. All it would take was one major shift in the environment to push the whole thing over the edge. And unfortunately for the Khmer, the Earth's climate was about to throw them a curveball that no engineer could have predicted. For decades, historians wondered what finally killed Angkor. Was it a massive invasion? Was it a plague? While wars did happen, they weren't the smoking gun. The real answer remained hidden for centuries inside the trunks of trees. Scientists recently traveled to the forests surrounding Angkor and took samples from ancient cypress trees. These trees are like biological history books. When there is a lot of rain, the tree grows a wide ring. When there is a drought, the ring is very thin. When researchers looked at the rings from the 14th and 15th centuries, they found something terrifying. The Khmer Empire wasn't just hit by a bad year, they were hit by a climate catastrophe. First, the region was struck by a series of mega-droughts that lasted for decades. For nearly 30 years, the monsoons almost completely failed. The giant Barays, the lifeblood of the city, began to dry up. The mud at the bottom cracked in the sun. The rice died in the fields. The million people of Angkor began to go hungry. +1. In a desperate attempt to save the city, the engineers did the only thing they could. They modified the system. They dug deeper into the reservoirs. They blocked off old canals to try and force every last drop of water into the center of the city. They broke their own rules of engineering just to survive. They made the system even more rigid and even more fragile. They were pruning the machine just to keep the heart beating. And then the weather flipped. Just as the Khmer were adjusting to the drought, the Mega-Monsoons arrived. These were the most violent storms the region had seen in 1,000 years. The rain didn't just fall, it exploded. Because the ground was hard and dry from the drought, it couldn't soak up the water. The water stayed on the surface and rushed toward the city. The Khmer water system was designed to handle a specific amount of water. It was like a sink that could only drain so fast. But now it was like someone had turned on 10 high-pressure hoses into that same sink. The surge of water was unstoppable. It hit the modified canals and reservoirs with the force of a tidal wave. Because the engineers had blocked certain paths during the drought, the water had nowhere to go. It backed up until the pressure became too much. The dams began to burst. One by one, the massive dirt walls of the Barays, the pride of the empire, collapsed. When a wall that is 3 stories high and holds billions of gallons of water breaks, it isn't just a leak, it is a disaster. A wall of water and mud roared through the city. It didn't just flood the houses, it physically erased them. It tore up the stone bridges. It carved giant gullies into the earth, some of them 20 feet deep. The most heartbreaking part was the feedback loop. As the floodwater destroyed the canals, it carried the debris into the next canal, clogging it and causing it to burst too. The city was literally tearing itself apart. The water machine had turned into a destruction machine. By the time the storm stopped, the infrastructure of Angkor was ruined. The canals were no longer connected. The reservoirs couldn't hold water. The smart city was broken beyond repair. The people didn't all die at once. Instead, there was a slow, painful exodus. Imagine living in a high-tech city where the electricity and water suddenly stop working forever. You can't grow food. You can't travel. The elite, the priests and the royals looked at the ruined city and realized it was over. They couldn't fix it. They didn't have the resources or the people left. So they did the only thing they could. They walked away. They moved south, toward the coast, to start a new life based on trade instead of irrigation. The jungle, which had been held back for 500 years, began to creep back in. Roots wrapped around the golden towers. Moss covered the faces of the god kings. The largest city on earth was swallowed by the green silence. The mystery of the vanished empire was finally solved. They were destroyed by the very thing they tried to control. They built a paradise that was too perfect to survive a changing world. The fall of Angkor wasn't just a local tragedy. It was a warning for every civilization that followed. When the king and his court finally abandoned the city in the year 1431, they left behind more than just stone. They left a lesson about what happens when we think we have finally conquered nature. For centuries, the world forgot Angkor even existed. European explorers who stumbled upon it in the 1800s thought it was built by the Romans or the Greeks. They couldn't believe that a lost tropical civilization could have reached such heights. But as we have seen, the Khmer weren't just lucky. They were the world's most advanced engineers. Their downfall didn't happen because they were weak. It happened because they were too successful. They built a system so massive that they couldn't afford a single mistake. Today we see the same patterns in our modern world. Our cities are bigger than ever. Our technology is more complex than it has ever been. We rely on massive systems for our water, our power, and our food. Just like the Khmer, we have built a grid that we assume will always work. But as the story of the hydraulic megacity shows us, nature always has the last word. When the climate shifts, even the strongest walls of dirt and stone can become useless. The reward, the secret at the bottom of the canal. As I promised at the beginning of this video, I have a final piece of the puzzle to share with you. This is the reward that proves exactly how the end felt for the people living there. A few years ago, archaeologists were excavating a major canal near the center of Angkor. They expected to find pieces of pottery, or perhaps a lost coin. Instead, they found something chilling. At the very bottom of the canal, buried under centuries of mud, they found a massive unfinished stone bridge. But here is the strange part. The bridge was built using stones stolen from a nearby temple. This tells us everything we need to know about the final days of the empire. It shows a city in a state of total panic. The water system was breaking, the floods were coming, and the engineers were so desperate that they tore down their holy temples just to try and plug the holes in their canals. They were sacrificing their gods to try and save their plumbing. This bridge was never finished. The flood arrived before they could lay the final stones. The water roared over the half-built structure and buried it in sand. It remained there, hidden and forgotten, for over 500 years. It is a frozen moment in time, the exact second that the Water Kingdom realized they had lost their war against the monsoon. Angkor is no longer a ghost city. Today it is a place of wonder that millions of people visit every year. But as you walk through those stone hallways and look at the massive reservoirs, remember that you aren't just looking at a beautiful ruin. You are looking at a machine. A machine that worked perfectly for half a millennium, until its creators forgot one simple truth. You can borrow power from nature, but eventually, nature always asks for it back.